All right, welcome everybody to the LabVIEW Experiment Live.
Welcome to the LabVIEW Experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes.
My card says to wait for a standing ovation. I don't, Thanks, Norm. I'm Taylor. I'm the producer of the LabVIEW Experiment, and we're super excited to be here at GDevCon N.A. in front of all of our fans and all of our listeners. So thank you for being here today. Before we get started, we want to give a second just to thank our sponsors.
Sam ruined my joke at the live recording of the LabVIEW Experiment, so I'm taking the time to fix it. Please laugh.
This episode of the LabVIEW Experiment podcast is brought to you by Control-Alt-Delete. We know that sometimes things just don't go as planned. We know that sometimes experiments fail. Control-Alt-Delete. Control-Alt-Delete will end everything and leave no trace. Try Control-Alt-Delete today.
Zaya Solutions. Can the Zaya team stand up? So Zaya's here today. Thanks so much.
Casey and Mike and Dan, right? Dan somewhere. Yeah, I've known these guys for a while. They're really good. They design really large, high-end actor framework systems. So if you've need some help with that, they are one of your options to talk to. So cool.
And then our next sponsor this season has been Binary Palette. I don't believe that Robbie is here. I think he's motorcycling across the country right now.
Yeah, he was supposed to be motorcycling across the country, but yes.
You can talk about what would they do?
Robbie is out of Detroit, and he does a lot of stuff in the automotive industry and a lot of automation stuff. And Robbie's a good guy. He also developed the LabVIEW Task Manager. For some of you people out there might remember that. So cool.
And then I also want to give a super special shout out to our one Patreon member. I don't believe that they're here with us today. That's Emre, but we do have a Patreon. And if you listened to episode 18 with Olivier, you know that we really value open source tools here. I'm calling us an open source tool, but they're not always viable. So if you're able to join the Patreon and give us some support there, we would love it. If you're interested in talking about a sponsorship, find me afterwards. So this episode is a little bit different, and for people that are listening at home, we sent out a survey to everybody here at GDevCon N.A. and asked them to provide some topics that they think would be interesting for us to talk about today, and whether they were willing to talk about them or not. So our topic today is keeping LabVIEW competitive with Beth Heath, Q Alldredge, and Any McDonald. Take it away, guys.
Yeah, so I'm going to let you guys just briefly introduce yourselves. Some of you don't need any introduction like Q.
I already introduced myself, so I will pass on.
I'm Beth Heath. I work for Milwaukee Tool as a principal automation engineer on the test automation group. So my team is about 7 LabVIEW developers working within a team that builds overall power tool test automation solutions for anything pre-production.
Any McDonald, founder and CEO of Voxomnia, just launched a few months ago, but most of my career was spent in the fluid power off-highway manufacturing world. Yeah.
Okay, so under the Keeping LabVIEW Competitive heading, there's really 2 questions that kind of came up in the survey. And the first one is related to bringing new people into LabVIEW. So it's kind of a question of where do we find new people? How do we train them? How do we bring people into the community? So I'll let you guys comment first, perhaps go around, and then each of you comment, and then we can take some questions.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess setting the stage, I've been interacting with LabVIEW since 2010 or 2011, introduced to it through college. But I found that it was an intense struggle to get, I was responsible for the lab in college, and we had to use LabVIEW, and getting the students to use it was very challenging. And so it's been kind of a constant struggle for me. And now, starting a business trying to do LabVIEW, how do we get more people excited to use it? Because it's hard, right? People say, well, it's really hard. It's so much easier just to use an Arduino or something. So how do we change that mindset? So
Yeah, so I've been recruiting for LabVIEW programmers for about 6 years now in different roles, and it's hard. There's not many in the Milwaukee area, so I largely train them and hire engineers who understand the real world systems and bring other skill sets. And then I found my training program's getting better, so I've brought up about 6 new developers within the last year, and within about 3 months, they're up to 80% efficiency for the medium to low complexity projects. So it works out pretty well.
Well, I agree with what these two have said. One of the problems that we've had is kind of an exodus from academia as NI is concerned, and we've had some discussion about that with NI. All of us LabVIEW champions meet, and one of the things that I think is hard is there's such an abundance of resources that are free now out there, like Python and all of these others that people learn, and I talked about one aspect that came about. Thanks Eric Reffett for helping spearhead this, was the community edition. That is a big step in the right direction. The other, The other big desire is if they could make that community edition extend to students. Now, I understand that, there's an academic license that some universities cover, but I think that if it was free for students, there would be a lot more people willing to pick it up and experiment with it. When I was in school, it just depended on the professor. I had to pick up, Python, I had to pick up Fortran, I had to pick up MATLAB, I had to pick up, it just depended on the teacher, what they wanted me to turn the assignment in as. If I had something that I could get for free, because as a broke college student, I would experiment with it, and I would have, but for me, it wasn't until I got into my first job before I really got sent to all the LabVIEW training. I didn't really see it much in school, so it would have been nice to have seen it in school. I would have gotten a heads up, but.
Yeah, thank you all for your comments. Does anybody in the audience have any questions or comments? I see a hand way back there. I think it's Eric.
You guys have the microphone.
Taylor's going to bring one around.
I'm coming.
Taylor's bringing one around.
Beth talked about measuring efficiency of people as you're training. I like the concept. How did you come up with they're 80% efficient within 6 months? What does that mean to you?
So I used to measure it a lot more accurately when I worked in consulting, and I measured hours. Honestly, measuring hours takes hours, and I no longer do it carefully. What I measure it by is how much of my time does it take to get them to write something that I don't tear apart. At about 3 months, I'd say I tear apart 20% instead of 90%, and I call that success.
There's another question over there, Casey.
Yeah, this is also in response to something Beth said, but I'm curious what other people think as well. Have you had more success kind of training engineers that don't have a computer science background and getting them up to speed, or the other way around, trying to take people that have a computer science background and converting them?
So my team's comprised of mechanical, electrical, optical, and physics majors, no CSs. So what I found is that if they weren't trained in a lot of text-based programming languages, they come with a lot more open mind and eagerness to learn. And also the type of systems we work on, being able to debug a full system and identify, is it the software or the mechanical or the electrical, comes in handy. So not having to teach that portion is huge. And if they're gonna come in with 2-3 weeks of LabVIEW experience, it's a 1 week head start. So I don't value that as highly as someone eager to learn and open to learning who understands the rest of the system.
Okay. Andy has a comment.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, in my last company, we had a desperate need for end-of-line test experts. We had like one guy who had been doing it for 30 years who was like going to retire. And so I started a LabVIEW class. We invited manufacturing and design engineers, so all mechanical mostly. We had 12 people, and 4 of them really stuck and got it and helped develop the next generation. But something for, I think, everyone to think about is how do you probably don't have to have these problems or conversations about some of the other languages. People just somehow find forums or whatever and learn these things. But we have to make regimented trainings to get people to use it. So the barrier to entry seems very high. So it's something I think for all of us to think about is how do we lower that barrier to entry? Because it is a fun language. It's super fun because you can do real stuff with it. It's not just...
I see 2 hands in the audience, but I have a question first. When you guys do training, what kind of training do you do? Do you send them to the NI training or do you do your own custom training?
So I did custom training. I bought everyone one of those little multifunction IOs, and we just made lights blink and made motors spin because budget was very tight in the manufacturing world.
Okay.
Yeah, I do custom training because it's hard to ask people to take a couple of weeks not doing any value add work, even if the value add work they're doing is slow. So I put them on a real project that's simple, pair them with a senior developer, and then sometimes they watch Core 1 and Core 2 if we've got a gap. And then I also buy them Fabiola's book and Post-it note all of the sections that they need to read.
So when I was at Hill Air Force Base before my job at Tesseract, we had one of our team members that was a certified instructor. So that helped. We got to do Core 1 and Core 2 in-house for a discount. So that always helped. But now it's more like we just have to bring them up and mentor them. And one thing that we always did I like what you said as a first project. One of the things that we would always do as a first project is get them to program a game. Just pick anything, have a project to work on. And as far as, computer science versus engineer, it seemed like my team at Hill was mostly electrical or mechanical engineers, and only a couple of them were computer scientists.
Thank you for those answers. I saw that Thomas raised his hand and Jim. Jim has a mic right there, so let's Jim go first, and Thomas, you can get a mic and get ready in a second.
Thanks, Sam. I was curious, you guys, the topic came up that people with experience in text-based programming languages have some maybe resistance or some barriers preventing them from using LabVIEW and maybe enjoying it. What do you see those barriers being?
Well, I think one barrier is some people still see LabVIEW as a toy. It's not, I got this all the time, is that LabVIEW is not a real programming language, even though it is. That misconception was always hard to overcome. And there was people higher up that had that misconception. I think part of that misconception, though, was brought about by people delivering bad product to them.
Yeah, echoing that, one of the things I like to do is show them some of the coolest applications we've developed that you can't necessarily tell it's LabVIEW, and then break the news that it's LabVIEW to them. And they're like, wow, I didn't know that was possible. I saw it in school for 1 week where I used a DAC to read one channel and I threw it away. So we use positive examples of solid programs demonstrating that LabVIEW can do anything. And then I ask them, give me 3 months. Give me 3 months to get you over the hurdles, and then we'll talk, but you need to stay with me for 3 months and give it a fair shot. And usually it's just that first couple of weeks of thinking in a different mindset, looking at it in a different way. And once they get over that initial shock, they often take to it, especially the mechanical and electrical engineers who are used to those types of visuals.
Yeah, echoing that a bit, I would start with something the GUI that they can interact with, push buttons, and then they realize it's LabVIEW. And then, I'm not a particularly smart person, but I like shapes and colors. And so I love programming in LabVIEW because it's very visual. It's the biggest selling point for me. And I found that when I can frame it that way for especially predominantly mechanical and electrical engineers, they start to like get on board too. Usually all I have to do is say, well, it's not going to be like your college C++ class. And they're like, oh, okay. They like that. And then we go through, it's a much prettier experience, I think. So.
Just to summarize, I think what I heard was that there's a perception that it's a toy and that having some kind of force, obligatory time with it, exposure to have fun with it will help them get over the fact that it's fun and that doesn't mean it's a toy. I'm curious if there's anything else you guys see that would be helpful. It sounds like it's kind of like a marketing, exposure, branding.
Well, and for me, it was always the biggest obstacle at my last company was getting funding for the licensing and stuff. I mean, it's pretty expensive to get the licensing, to get the hardware, to do stuff. I was so happy when the community edition was announced because I had bought like some, I assume legit 2014 version that I was using at home. So happy when the community version came out.
I think one of the other problems too is just like a mindset shift in the way that you program, because data flow is very different from like that sequential execution order in C and C++ and things like that. And I feel like people struggle. I think we've all seen somebody who is a C programmer and they have the VI and it has in the front like the sequence structure to like initialize all the variables and everything, right? So I think everybody kind of knows what I'm talking about there. So it's just kind of adopting a different mindset, I think, can be challenging for some people.
The other thing I like to do is have them make something move as soon as I can. As soon as they see a system come to life, I see the light pop in for them when they're programming.
Cool. Thank you, Jim. That was a very good question. Thomas also has a question.
So I believe LabVIEW was involved with Lego in the past for Mindstorms. Was that helpful, and is that something that would come back?
I grew up with Lego Mindstorms. I thought they were awesome, and maybe that's part of why I took to LabVIEW, between that and parallels to Simulink in college. I found it helpful, but I can't speak for everyone.
Well, if I could follow with that, because we did mention Arduino as kind of like a competitor for something that could be easy to use. I know that in the past, some company, I had a bit of a shoestring budget where we would use Arduino with LabVIEW in place of a DAC. And having that as some type of an introduction, or at least more at the child level, where we could introduce the young minds into the system.
Steve Watts just stepped out of the room, but I know he is working on that. They're trying to get a Linux image with the Community Edition on board and be able to talk to Raspberry Pis and stuff so they can do some kind of introductory course.
Yeah,
So,
when he's back, hit him up about that. It's really interesting. And he also wrote about it on his blog, the Ramblings blog, whatever.
random ramblings on the NI forums. We can include a link in the show notes.
Yeah,
But, yes.
so that's something. And you're right. I mean, I did some hobbyist stuff too. I don't know if some of you have seen GLA Summit a couple of years ago. Me, again, being a Harry Potter fan that I am, made a Weasley clock. Now, if you don't know the Weasley family, they had a magical clock that had a hand on it for every member of the family, and that hand would move based on where the family member was at. And so I got a Raspberry Pi and LabVIEW Community Edition and made my own Weasley clock, and it responds to my family members' phones and tracks where my family members are at and moves around the clock and lights up and plays the Harry Potter theme song on the hour, and it's a lot of fun.
You should definitely see his presentation. And then you'll ask yourself where he finds the time to do all of this stuff, but that's a different question.
That was pandemic that gave me that time, I guess. But that's a good way to start learning, is to have that cheap piece of hardware, and that's what Steve Watts is really trying to do, is bring training with that, paired with that cheap hardware.
Fabiola has a question.
Well, it's more of a comment. I just wanted to, like you were saying about how to introduce people that come with text-based language experience. What I've been doing is telling them a couple of things that they need to leave outside. The first thing is they need to understand that it's not interpreted, it's compiled. And any time that things start being difficult is because they're getting in the way of the compiler. That's something an experienced C programmer, experienced text programmer is going to understand. So you start with that. The second thing is you tell them this is parallel, not sequential. And just tell them to picture what they would have to do to run 4 processes in parallel at different rates. And then you show them 4 for loops or while loops. And you show them the task manager. And you put different weights on the while loops. And just wait for the reaction. And then you do what you guys said about, the last one is you don't declare variables. The creation of a wire declares a variable. Again, wait for the mind explosion. That's it.
Norm over here has a question. Can we get a mic?
Before you speak up, one thing, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Norm. I made a page on the LabVIEW Wiki if anyone's interested. Maybe it can be added to, that translates text-based terminology to G-based terminology, just for help in some of those instances.
Just a reminder, the wiki is open source, so anybody can go contribute. So somebody could go listen to Fabiola's comments and go type them in there. That'd be good.
Okay. Can I go?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Actually, I'm really grateful that Fabiola mentioned that because she really teed up what was on my mind, and I'd love to hear and extend on that. And also, I was going to say, instead of I guess the question that Jim had asked was answered with kind of the negative side of it. But what I was curious about is how do we, what would y'all declare as the most powerful and truly unique things that have been successful to convey to people to say, okay, I got to give this a shot, or, right, there's a certain level of implicit force, of course, that you could make on a person, but have we as a community, much like what the situations that Fab mentioned of, here's these scenarios, right? Can we have that more healthy list? And clearly we can now on the LabVIEW Wiki because somebody's going to go and add it up there. But I would be curious as to, can we see that wiki page, not only Fabiola's thoughts, but y'all's thoughts from up on the stage of not only things that we know are powerful and interesting, but things that have actually caused successful change of minds and hearts.
I think I guess I'm thinking of 3 things. First off is just how easy it is to see what's going on. For me, it's a lot easier to see that picture of what's going on in your code than to try to read down a list of commands or lines of commands. And along that same line, number 2 is engineers are already programming in LabVIEW, sort of. They don't know it. When they go plan out their architecture and they're drawing a flow chart, and drawing what the processes are that they want to happen, that's like, that would have been Jeff Kadofsky's dream, is to have the flow chart first, and then you dive into it, and then you add the programming, right? But that's basically what LabVIEW is it has the flow chart and that, and then and the parallelism with that. The third thing, sorry, I only have 3 things. The third thing that really sold people on it, as far as me trying to sell someone to let me use LabVIEW on their project, is how easy it is to interface with hardware. And the ease at which I can set up that communication.
So I may be weird, but for me, the thing that I like is I don't have to worry about syntax. I don't have to worry about whether I need a semicolon or a colon or whatever. I think that's really, yeah.
Those are your things. What are the things that do other people, sorry.
Well, I guess I'm making the assumption that perhaps there are other people out there in the world like me, but I may be that unique, so.
Fair enough. Yeah, I guess the question was not necessarily what we like, but what are those things absolutely that you found that other people have really clombed onto. But yeah, syntax, and I love you don't have to name variables that Fab mentioned. Yeah, please.
Yeah, the other things I find parallelism to Fab's point. Ease of UIs. When I do a UI concept, I draw it in LabVIEW, and I just don't put any code on the block diagram. I don't have to use a separate tool. And then hardware interfaces. There's something else, but I'm blinking. Go for it, Andy.
For me, it was engineering without limits. My last company did all sorts of things. It was a manufacturing company and they had a lab and all these other things. So I applied it fanatically, probably inappropriately in many cases, but it showed the other people who started to catch on that you could use LabVIEW for absolutely everything. For hardware communication, you could use it for end-of-line testing, laboratory, or we used it for like KPI tracking for the management team. We used it for everything. So it's like it's one tool that you can apply extremely broadly if you take the time to learn it. So that's what other people.
To that point, I think one of the strengths of LabVIEW is that fact that you can use it for rapid prototyping, right? You can throw together a few DAC VIs and a graph and like look at a signal right away. But then you can use that same tool to go build really complex and complicated things, right? And I feel like it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you get people who only can do those simple things and then they try to build more complex things and they cause a lot of problems. But the fact that you can use the same tool for both of those things, I think is really interesting.
Another thing is LabVIEW is the only language I'm successful with programming on an airplane with no internet access and no Stack Exchange. And maybe that's partly because of LabVIEW is what I have most time in, but it's pretty cool that I don't have to look up a bunch of resources online all the time.
Did we answer your question well enough, Norm? Because I see some other hands. I see your hand, Brian, but Sergio had his hand up first. Maybe we can get Sergio mic first, right up here up front, and then we'll get Brian.
So how would you tackle the resistance from a team that has had horrible experiences when somebody tried to innovate, but now you are part of that team, you're trying to innovate, and you have to tackle that? Let's say you want to start using something that they haven't used before. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm getting to the right approach and how to do things instead of just hiding it and then breaking the news to them, as you said, that I'm using the QMH or something else. So how would you tackle that to management specifically?
I don't consider hiding it. I consider trialing it. I'll trial it myself before I roll it out to the team. So put the positive spin on it and show the benefits of it. For me, the first time I did a 12-station DQMH project in 6 weeks, that's when I got bought in from the rest of the team.
That sounds like a great experiment. We should do more experiments. Okay, hopefully that answered your question. Brian has a question, then we got to wrap it up soon. Okay. Oh, okay. So Brian's question has been answered. We about done, Taylor? Or we have time for one more? I see Thomas raising his hand again. Okay.
So I want to ask about LabVIEW CVI, and I know that going between CVI and LabVIEW graphical interface is not friendly. Is there any thought that can happen, that can be friendly to help close the gap between the two?
I think this may be a question for the audience because I see everybody up here shaking their head that they've not really used CVI. I've only ever used it teaching the test stand course, and that's like you create one CVI thing just to show that you can do it. So does anybody out there have any experience that wants to answer Thomas's question? I see Eric Ruffett in the back.
The question is, did you mean Lab Windows CVI? Because LabVIEW CVI is not. Yes, I do.
Yeah, so Eric was clarifying that it's Lab Windows CVI, not LabVIEw CVI or something like that, I think. Is that all you had to add, Eric, or did you actually have an answer?
I can't answer a question about Lab Windows CVI.
Oh,
Jesus.
Okay. All right, it appears there are not many CVI programmers out there, which does not surprise me much. One last question over here. Oh.
So I guess one of the things I was going to bring up is kind of related to, I guess, what we were just talking about say you have like a C, C++ programmer and you want to try and demonstrate to them very quickly that LabVIEW is also a very capable language. One of the things that I've found that is really successful is showing them like the LabVIEW memory manager and how to actually do pointer operations directly. Because there's a lot of power in that. And there's a lot of things you can do with that. And it also kind of grounds them and helps them see like, no, this is a real language. You're actually hard allocating things. And you can, wrap things like POSIX libraries on the Linux RT targets to do like memory mapping and shared memory. And so I think showing people more advanced things like that is a great way to kind of at least get them a chance to see like, you can do a lot more with it than you think. And there's a very high ceiling to, what possible development can be done with LabVIEW.
I think there may be a lot of people in this room who would like to see that. Because I don't think that's very well known. That's not something I've had to do it before?
If you guys ever want to take a look, I think like 7 years ago, I published a package on VI Package Manager called Linux RT Inter-Process Communication. And I basically created like native wrappers for shared memory, mutexes, semaphores, all that. And I have an example in there that basically is like a C application you can launch on, like, using PuTTY on like a compact Rio. And it'll actually do like a memory map between LabVIEW and the C application. So anything that you write to that memory space, from LabVIEW is directly visible to C. And then I can't remember if I use like, FIFOs or something else from the POSIX library to do like the actual synchronization of the execution. So yeah, I like showing that to people because it's like, no, it's a real language and you can do literally anything you can in C basically in LabVIEW. So
very cool. All right. I think that's about it, Taylor, right? Yeah.
30 minutes.
Oh, I thought you said 3. She said 30. Okay. Never mind. Okay. So the topic that came up, the keeping LabVIEW competitive, there were really 2 parts. One was how do we bring people into the ecosystem? And the other part, which is very related, I think Q hit on it earlier on, is how do we compete and how do we compare what we're doing to people in Rust and Python and C, and how do we not only maybe bring them along, but how do we collaborate with them? How do we work together? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Do you guys have any thoughts first? And then we'll take some questions.
I have a probably unhelpful thought, and that's just the question that goes through my head is, what are they doing differently for Python, Arduino, things like that? What are they doing differently that they have these legions of young people constantly playing around and doing things with it? What are they doing differently that,
They're giving it away for free. They're giving it away for free.
Okay, but I think if we challenge ourselves, it can't be free, but, we did it in the community edition, though, so it's a big part of it. But I think that I'm sure they talk about this in NI boardrooms or whatever, but what is getting millions of people using these other tools?
Well, so when it comes to the community edition, not only is Python free, but it's also much lower friction. I don't have to go to the Python website and sign up and give them my email and get a license key and all this stuff. I just download it. So that is definitely one potential thing that we could do that would make it easier. Well, the NI can do to make it easier.
I think another thing that hampers adoption, and this is what I'm also involved with G Central. If you've ever heard of G Central, it's an organization, it's a nonprofit, and basically it's our mission to try to do exactly this, is try to help LabVIEW be more mainstream. Our mission is to help LabVIEW programmers make a better version of, or help the LabVIEW community make a better version of itself. One of the things that was in our mission initially was to help the community have more libraries out there. Like if you go to PyPy or PyPI, however you say that, it's a huge library of just tons of things that are written in Python, excuse me. And just basically almost anything you want to do, you could go Google that, go search that and find something. And I got to congratulate JKI, with VIPM and VIPM.io, that has helped out a lot toward that end, especially being able to publish stuff a lot easier. My first toolkit that I published, I tried to go through the NI Tools Network, and it took months and was not a fun experience.
Only months?
Yeah. Yeah. And then, but as those of you that have followed VIPM.io recently, I decided I was finally going to publish a bunch of my Q controls that I had created, and published like 10 of them in the last 2 months.
Yeah, I published a package recently, and it took an hour. And I was like, wow, okay. That was really easy. It's
really simple. If you need help with the VI Package Manager build tool, there's tools out there. Derek Bombrito did a presentation to help you with that and stuff. So I think that's one thing to help adoption, is just to have more tools out there and readily available.
This may be controversial, but I don't know that the 1 week lab in colleges is helping our case. A lot of people come out of that thinking that's all LabVIEW is. And that first week is the most frustrating week in my experience. So I had a really positive experience with LEGO Mindstorms. I've heard positive experiences with FIRST Robotics. I've had very few people come out of their 1 week in their college course with a positive impression, and I'd rather them come in open-minded.
Yeah, and I think maybe that's one of the main conduits for people getting started is the college courses, but it's a college course, so it already kind of sucks. You're being tested on it, and you're forced to do it. So yeah, what ways can it be really exciting? And you have all these people talking about it and doing all this stuff. I don't know the answer, but that's the question. I think we need to ask ourselves.
I'm thinking maybe senior projects and stuff, getting those involved using LabVIEW, because then you can do something more advanced too. And I mean, part of it has to be giving them the choice and saying, you can use all these languages and here's LabVIEW and you can use that if you want. And if they choose it, then I think that would help adoption a bit.
Yeah, I've heard negative impression from the week in college courses, but those who have used it in research projects or longer term experiments have come away with a much better view.
I see a question there. Is that Eric? Tyler.
Yeah, so one thing I think you guys touched upon was greater collaboration with people using other languages. So something we're doing right now, I have an intern who's doing some machine learning text recognition with Python. And one of the things that she's not able to really do is create a really good UI. So we're going to use that to build a LabVIEW UI that can take her information that she's getting and then put it into our test systems to make it easy to view and to use later. So we're able to collaborate and really use both languages together to make something better.
I very much like where you're going with that. I think there is a lot of room for collaboration. I find I work on a lot of projects, and maybe other people have similar experiences, where the LabVIEW side is used for the data collection, and then we pretty much just dump it to a CSV or some file, and then it gets read into Python, and they do all the analysis in Python. And my thought process has always been, we can take those Python scripts, we can run them through the Python node, we can display those results in real time right there. You don't have to go off and run some separate process and send it to the data processing guy. Have the data processing guy just write the Python scripts and send them to us. So...
Yeah, I've had the same thing. I've had requesters come to my team and just about mandate that we write the whole thing in Python. And when I really dug into the whys, it was that they wanted their post-processing run and they wanted control of their post-processing. Using the Python node, and I haven't done it yet, but the virtual environments I'm very excited for, has really helped that because I've taken that manual step out of their process.
I guess I'm a little more old school because I think if it can be done in Python, why don't it just be done in LabVIEW?
Well, I think part of the problem is sometimes those analysis routines are already written. That's part of it. And also, for machine learning stuff, there are a lot of libraries already written in Python. And I know there are some in LabVIEW, but I don't think there are as many or as well known or well used. Thomas, did you have a question? Jeff's got a mic there for you.
So this one might be a little far-fetched, but if using Excel or any of the Microsoft document space, I use VB sometimes to just get through some more complicated features. Would it be too far-fetched to imagine that we could work with them to offer a graphical interface in that place that Microsoft or someone else would be interested to kind of ease the use of their systems?
I've got two comments on that. One is related to Steve Watts, who's not here. Open document formats. I know Steve does a lot of that stuff, and then you don't need the ActiveX things. Darren mentioned something about having an Excel reader, so you should talk to him later. Maybe that'll come up later. And there was another thought. For database stuff, you should really, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Powell's SQLite toolkit, and you can do some really powerful stuff really quickly with that, and it's a heck of a lot better than Access. So, I mean, I don't know if that fits your use case, depending on what you're doing, but
my interest was more since you have the graphical user interface and just going after what was said earlier by Beth, where the other engineering disciplines seem to take onto it more than somebody who's already into scripted programming languages. If the person is more data analytical, more sitting in the world of Excel, or early on in their school or career that they're just learning these things, would it be nice to introduce a graphical interface for them? Would we be able to introduce that to the Excel or the Microsoft environment?
So you're thinking VBA macros, but written in LabVIEW? Is that kind of where you go with that?
Yes.
That's very interesting. It sounds cool. I have no idea how that works, but Jeremy, does that answer your question more or less? I mean, sorry. Did Jeremy have a question? Oh, Jeremy's signaling time. Okay. Will, do we have time for one more question? 5 minutes. Okay. Will.
Can you hear me? All right. So I was actually going to go back to the collaboration idea, and that actually, I think, falls into the understanding of like, how do you actually get people to understand the value of LabVIEW? So there's, I think, two different ideas that I had, which the first was we were kind of talking about, but not really stating, is that every language exists for a reason, right? They have specific strengths and they have specific weaknesses. And the world, and especially in technology, is getting so complex to the point where like one tool isn't really the right solution for everything anymore. And so it's really important to understand what tool meets what need and how to tie them together. So having that understanding of, okay, well, you know, like, I think the data analytics, right, was really a great example of like Python has so many resources focused on making that easy and efficient, but rendering decent UIs, for example, right, and putting that all together, that's not really a very good strength for Python right now, right? And so being able to combine those and use those different technologies intelligently is a great way to prove out that collaboration is not only possible, but actually preferred. And then just one quick aside as far as like the value of LabVIEW and proving to other people, I think it's important, like you can just look around this room, like how many different companies use LabVIEW for so many different important purposes. And so like we just recently went in with a customer and we'd had to, even though their test engineers were actively using LabVIEW when we were selling them a system for a new test architecture, they were like, why are my people using LabVIEW in the first place? Why shouldn't we just switch? Right. And it was, you know, all I really had to say was like, well, look at all the other companies and what they're doing with LabVIEW today, right? Like SpaceX is using LabVIEw for mission control, Large Hadron Collider for data acquisition, you know, Blue Origin's actively using it, you know, like, well, yeah, you know, Milwaukee, the Air Force, DoD, you know, there's so many really interesting applications for it that are already in use. And so just relying on the community to prove out that like, no, this, just because you don't know much about it doesn't mean that it's not valuable, right? And so just being able to share what the community is actively doing can really go a long way into convincing people that it's worth learning more about.
I think that's a great point. Your use of Python and machine learning also reminded me another area where I think LabVIEW can collaborate with other things is with web technologies, right? Like JSON, or not JSON, JavaScript, right? Like, I know we have the LabVIEW web, whatever toolkit, but like, you know, I don't think anybody's making serious websites in that. Maybe some of them are, but that's probably where I would use JavaScript. So
another, I want to put in a plug for Eric and Casey too. Another aspect is for interoperability and stuff like that. There's an idea, well, we started a forum called the GID Exchange. Is that live now, Casey? The GID Exchange forum?
I don't know. It was
okay. It's supposed to be. So it actually exists on the NI community forums, and it's going to be a lot like the LabVIEW Idea Exchange. Eric's going to talk more about it at his presentation tomorrow. But one of the ideas that got submitted to us was actually from Sam, and it was to have a automated wrapper that could go wrap a Python library and make a wrapper around it using the Python nodes and call it directly.
Yeah, I was thinking that there's a tool that does that currently for DLLs, I think. And it would be kind of interesting to have a tool like that for LabVIEW, just to make it even easier to use. I think we have time for one last question. Adam, Fern?
Sort of tying in the last several things, expanding on what the gentleman over here said. Regarding LabVIEW's competitiveness, I think for a long time it's been interoperable with C++, C# came along, now Python is there. That's key. But also knowing our market, I think, is important. Someone asked Beth, I think, what do you do for CS people? CS people that wind up in engineering we have a use case to sell them on LabVIEW, but I may be unique, maybe there's other people, is that my background was aerospace, manufacturing, and then eventually electrical, and I would consider myself today a software engineer, and the very first language I learned was LabVIEW, and I've since learned Python and C++ and C#. The reason I think I'm a good software engineer is because I learned LabVIEW, and it was interesting to me because I'm not a CS person. I'm not going to go write banking software. I'm not going to go write information system software. I'm interested in being a good software engineer for helping solve engineering problems. And I think that's where LabVIEW really, really shines. And so if we can introduce it to people with their awareness of that and make sure that is what they want to be good at software for, I think that's another key point, is knowing the intentions for it, the specificity, its strengths, and selling it to the people who are going to leverage those things.
I think that's a great point. Do we have any last comments from the panelists? Anybody got anything to say or add to that?
I'm not necessarily dabbing in the same vein. I mean, I just started a company that's largely relying on LabVIEW as our main tool. And so this question is, our future depends on it. I think everyone in this room's future depends on it. So the less it can be, kind of sometimes feels like an elite club, the less it can be like that, and the more it can be for everyone doing cool stuff, the better.
Very cool. Are we wrapping up? Oh, Beth. Oh, do you guys have a last comment? Oh, sorry. I didn't think they did. That's why I was like, yeah. They were looking at me like I don't have anything to say. So sorry.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for our panelists for joining us today. Thank you for GDevCon for allowing us to do this live recording. It's super special. We're really happy to be a part of this community and to be able to provide this resource and also get so much information and knowledge from all of you. And one more thanks to our sponsors as well. If you find us on the break in the lobby, we've got some LabVIEW t-shirts to give away. So make sure you find us on the break at 3:00. And thank you so much.
Yeah, and we'll have the little commercial running that we couldn't get up earlier. We'll have that at the break. You should watch it. It's pretty funny. I'm sorry we missed it.
Yeah, Sam ruined my joke. It's fine.
Yeah, it was quite the joke. So you'll go watch it and you'll laugh.
Awesome. Thank you.
We'd like to thank Mark Bala, camera operator, Kevin Cheery, camera operator, video editor, and audio mix, Noah Mittman, camera operator, and Rachel at the Buffalo Rose for the audio feed.
That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the LV Experiment.